Hello and welcome to the first session of NCCP 710-1014, Reintroduction to Metaphysics, the first part of a two-part seminar. This first part seminar is called the Speculative Return. Would just like to thank all of you guys for being a part of this, I think, pretty amazing seminar that we're going to be doing. I would like to introduce now our instructor, our lecturer, Pete Wolfendale.
Hello? Okay, great. Before I leap straight into the actual content of the course, I just want to thank Mo and Tony for inviting me to do this. This is actually the first proper course I ever taught, and I'm really looking forward to it. Both just as a course and experimenting with what seems like a very interesting medium for this. You should have all read the kind of course outline. The reason this course is called Reintroduction to Metaphysics is a bit of a pun on Heidegger's book Introduction to Metaphysics, which I don't know if anybody's ever read it, but is possibly one of the worst introductions to metaphysics that's ever been written. It's a great book, but it's a terrible introduction. The reason I kind of want to do this course as a reintroduction to metaphysics is that it's a concept and a discipline that's increasingly popular, or there's an increasing amount of interest in it within philosophy, but also outside of philosophical circles. And this is an interest which has come about after a long period of disinterest and sometimes active hostility in the 20th century. But despite the sort of renewed interest in it, I think there's not a strong sense of what it is exactly. People have a kind of understanding of certain metaphysical questions or certain examples of what a metaphysical theory might be, but they don't have a kind of general conception of what metaphysics is as such. So that's the kind of real underlying theme or topic of this course. The way I'm going to approach that theme, we'll go through various different stages in the different lectures. But the other thing I should mention, which I'm going to use as a way into a lot of the issues surrounding this core theme, is the emergence of what's called speculative realism. And I was just saying, in response to a question before we went live, that I don't think speculative realism indexes any kind of substantive content, no kind of unitary philosophical movement, but it does indicate a certain kind of historical sociological event, a certain kind of confluence. And particularly, it responds to the increasing desire for doing positive metaphysics within the continental tradition. And because people are interested in understanding the particular thinkers and ideas that are associated with that confluence, I'm going to try and use those thinkers as windows into particular metaphysical topics that will give us an insight into the nature of metaphysics as such. Right. That being said, I'm going to just kind of leap straight into lecture 1, which is called The Return of Speculation. Now, in order to talk about this return of speculation in, say, speculative realism, I think it's necessary to actually talk about how it initially emerged and how it went away in the first place. So I'm going to try and discuss the history of metaphysics. Before then, I just want to kind of outline this question of what metaphysics is and why we're interested in it. let's start with a few potential definitions of metaphysics. You'll rarely find anyone willing to actually define it. You do occasionally get ones. Now, Brooker earlier gave us a definition from Wilfrid Sellars, which is the inquiry into how things in the broadest possible sense of the term hang together in the broadest possible sense of the term. Now, what's interesting about that is that's a definition of philosophy as far as Sellars is concerned, not a definition of metaphysics. So I've seen several people reach for that as a definition of metaphysics, but it does raise an interesting question as to what the difference between philosophy as a whole and metaphysics as a subspecies of philosophy is. I mean, some people do just think that, well, metaphysics just is philosophy, philosophy just is metaphysics. But other people would disagree, so that's an issue straight away from that definition. Some other definitions I've cherry-picked from places. The inquiry into the fundamental structure of reality. And the words tend to get mixed around here. Sometimes people will say, well, we're interested in the fundamental nature of reality, or the fundamental structure of nature. So you'll get these words, nature, reality, structure, fundamentality, get thrown around, but not often very well defined, and sometimes treated as synonymous in ways where it's not clear what we're talking about. Definition from A.W. Moore, who wrote this book recently called The Evolution of Modern Metaphysics. He calls metaphysics the most general attempt to make sense of things, which again sounds a lot like that definition from Wilfrid Sellars. And just to kind of close off with Wikipedia, Wikipedia defines metaphysics as the attempt to clarify the fundamental notions by which people understand the world. For example, existence, objects, properties, space, time, cause and effect, and possibility. Now, what we get throughout these various definitions are concerns with generality on the one hand, right, and fundamentality on the other. And this concern with generality and fundamentality is split both with regard to a concern with what is, or interested in what fundamentally is, what fundamentally is real, for instance, and a concern with how we think about the world. So we're interested. So one of the way of looking at it is to say, well, we're interested in the most fundamental way of thinking about the world, or the most fundamental discipline involved within the process of human knowledge. And both of those things can be understood in terms of generality. So, people might say metaphysics is concerned with everything that is, insofar as it is, like the most general thinking about what there is and what there can be. Or they might say that, well, metaphysics is about the most general concepts we use for thinking about what is. And that's what we get from the Wikipedia definition, is this concern with what you might call categorical concepts. So we have this kind of strange concern with fundamentally and generality, either in terms of the definition of the subject matter, or in terms of the definition of how it is thought about. I'd like people to sort of think about these things as we go through the course. Now, some specific examples of metaphysical questions, which are supposed to somehow fit into this overarching concern. So a classic is, why is there something rather than nothing? Why does anything exist? This is a question I'll come back to, particularly in relation to Museu's work. Does time have a beginning or an end? Right, that's a very classical metaphysical question that Kant famously says we can't answer. What is causation? Are there fundamental entities? Are there basic building blocks of reality, like classic philosophical atoms or not? And probably the most commonly asked metaphysical question of all time: does God exist? And various variants of that. These are all kind of taken as characteristic metaphysical questions, but it's not clear how we treat them as all aspects of a single kind of inquiry. And so that's what we're interested in. How can all of these kinds of questions belong to a single kind of inquiry, and or what is the methodology of such an inquiry that would answer them all? Now, I've already mentioned that the concern of this course is to kind of reintroduce metaphysics after a certain period in which metaphysics became unpopular or people became actively hostile to it. I'd like to say just a couple things about that. In fact, no, I'm going to skip that. Actually, tell you what, I'll skip that. All I'll mention is that people have been skeptical about metaphysics for a long time. Hume is the most famous kind of metaphysical skeptic. He basically thought that metaphysics, metaphysical knowledge was impossible because it, in some sense, transcended experience and what could be studied by the empirical sciences. However, the real trend in rejecting metaphysics only really kind of kicks off in the 20th century, following certain sort of misunderstandings of Kant. So an important thing to mention about Kant is that people often think that Kant was anti-metaphysics. He wasn't. He just thought metaphysics had to be delimited, and we'll talk about that more later. But more particularly in relation to what Quentin Museu calls correlationism, which is a sort of trend in thought that comes out of Kant. And it doesn't come out of his critique of metaphysics, but rather his particular epistemology, and is importantly this distinction between phenomena and noumena. So Kant fundamentally places things in themselves, the noumena, beyond the possibility of knowledge because they're fundamentally beyond experience. And he doesn't think that we can't think about them, but he thinks that our ability to think about them is fundamentally constrained, and we simply have to give up our ability to answer certain questions about them. This idea in germ becomes the sort of beginning of a whole trend in thought where people think that there is something about our thought itself that prevents us from getting at reality. So that all we ever have is appearances as conditioned by the particular structures of our thinking, be they, as in Kant, forms of sensibility, or as in, say, Wittgenstein, language games, or particular biological or cultural specificities of the way we are. These are supposed to, in some sense, distort reality and leave us at best being able to talk about reality as it appears to us. And that's the kind of essence of correlationism, and it was very, very popular in the 20th century, both in the analytic and continental camps, but in different ways. And I'll come back and I'll talk about that as we go through the history. But just to kind of give you an example of its popularity, both, say, Richard Rorty, coming from the analytic side, or Jürgen Habermas, coming from a slightly more continental side, both of them are slightly abridged figures. Both of them, declared the age of metaphysics to be over in the 20th century. Both of them felt that metaphysics had fundamentally been discredited, and that what we were left with was some kind of pragmatism, be it transcendental or otherwise. And that just, the sheer confidence that they could have in making such pronouncements is a kind of indicative of the way metaphysics was thought about in the beginning of the 20th century. Right. Okay, so oh, I had a couple of the series of questions just quickly before I get into the history. Now I keep saying that, but Here are some methodological questions regarding the nature of metaphysics, that just like people to bear in mind as we go through. So there's an interesting, we already raised one of these. What's the relationship between metaphysics and philosophy? Are they the same, or is metaphysics defined as a subspecies of philosophy? Can it clearly be defined as a subspecies of philosophy? We can equally ask what's the relation between metaphysics and science, particularly what's the relationship between metaphysics and physics. This is something that's going to become important when we talk about Ian Grant's work. What's the relationship between metaphysics and ethics? And what is the relationship between metaphysics and logic? The ethics and logic being the other kind of classic philosophical disciplines. Right. Another way of organizing those relations is to think about in what sense metaphysics is comprehensive, in what sense it thinks about everything. So for instance, do we include things like ethical norms within the space of everything that we think that metaphysics talks about? Do we include fictional characters? Do we include beliefs, desires, or are those things something fundamentally distinct? And in what sense metaphysics is foundational? In what sense you need to do metaphysics in order to do science or logic, or vice versa? What are the kind of relations of priority? Right. Sorry about that. Let's move on to the history of metaphysics. So, here is an attempt at a brief history of metaphysics, starting in Greece. And the fact that it starts in Greece gives us a certain pause, because you might ask, well, in what sense is metaphysics some kind of universal notion, or in what sense is it somehow culturally bounded by this history coming out of Greece? In what sense is it, is it an intrinsically Western idea? Now, I think it's important to recognize that although understanding the history and evolution of the discipline, the term, and thus understanding its specific links to the history of Western culture is important, I think it's important for giving us a grasp upon something more universal. And I think the best way to see this is just to see the use of the notion of metaphysics in its universal application. I think the kind of classic area of subject matter here is basically in the study of religions, non-Western religions, and things like Eastern philosophy. Not that I'm expert on any of these things, but crucially, take for instance the question I raised earlier: does God exist? It is incredibly helpful in trying to understand non-Western modes of thought. The extent to which we would classify them as theistic, be it monotheistic or polytheistic. And fundamentally, to do so is to try and differentiate between some kind of metaphysical content they have, some kind of account of the nature of the world, as opposed to what we think of as being a more kind of ethical orientation regarding prescriptions for living both socially and individually. In order to make those kinds of distinctions, and in order to start working our way between things like internal differentiations within Buddhist thought, or various other kind of traditions, being able to identify these traditions as having metaphysical components is incredibly useful. But to do so, we have to abandon the idea that the term metaphysics can only be applied within a Western context because of its origin. Nevertheless, we have to be aware of that history and that origin if we're to avoid smuggling in certain specific aspects of its history and its content, which then distort our views of those other traditions of thought we're trying to view through that metaphysical lens. So, it's the rough kind of methodology here is knowing the history is important, but it's important for our attempt to grasp something trans-historical. At least that's my opinion. And that's the way I'm going to approach the issue. Crucially, also, in the history I'm about to kind of start going through, I think you see this kind of view through that metaphysical lens. Oh, is so. Can people hear me okay? I just got a bit of the.
Yeah. Somebody just joined, so it's,
okay.
That's probably what you got.
Just getting an echo. Okay. I think this sort of journey from particular culturally specific modes of thinking towards the kind of delineation of more universal concepts that can be applied outside of those contexts, is something that's actually revealed within the history of metaphysics or the history of philosophy coming out of Greece. This is something something else I kind of like people to pay attention to, is you see this in the evolution of the language. So there are a variety of concepts that we can use within a theoretical context that we're kind of like reasonably familiar with these days. You know, existence, essence, possibility, persistence, substance. You know, we have a whole kind of vocabulary that had to actually come into existence at some time. It had to emerge and develop, and it had to emerge and develop out of a more culturally specific everyday vocabulary. And this is what you see in the emergence of philosophical thought within Greece. And I'll try and kind of make clear just how precarious some of the sort of initial attempts to introduce philosophical terms within the tradition are, and how they only kind of become more determinate and applicable as the tradition evolves. Right, okay. Now the actual history. For anybody who read the Heidegger, you'll know that the term metaphysics only actually turns up when it comes to the categorization of Aristotle's work. But I think it's important to say that there was something resembling metaphysics, or at least something incorporating what we will come to think of as metaphysics going on before then, and even before Aristotle. And the crucial place to start, and this is where Aristotle himself starts in starting to think about these things, is with the PreSocratic philosophers. And Aristotle calls these the physiologoi, right, which kind of transliterated as the physiologists. But what this means is they are inquiring into nature, which in Greek is physis. I think Heidegger's reading of this, which I set up for the reading, is fundamentally right. And what Heidegger does is to say that when the Greeks were originally talking about nature, the kind of root of the word is physis is this kind of conception of growth. But Heidegger kind of gives this a much more kind of ponderous translation as the prevailing of beings as a whole. But really what this incorporates is a sort of intertwined conception of change and persistence. So what the Greeks are getting, what the pre-Socratics are getting at and trying to think about nature is both the way in which the world changes over time, the way in which things within the natural world kind of develop and the dynamics governing them independent of us, but also the persistence of these dynamics themselves. So, for instance, the fact that the seasons change in a reliable pattern, which nevertheless persists. The pattern persists even though the seasons change. And when trying to think about physis as such, the pre-Socratics are trying to think about this sort of relationship between change and persistence as it applies to everything as a whole. They're trying to think through the totality of this kind of persistent dynamic that we find ourselves in and included in. Now, what the pre-Socratic philosophers do, I mean, the classic philosophers here are Thales and Anaximenes, is to provide what they call an arche for nature, which is to say a fundamental principle. And you have to think again, they don't have a huge range of terminology for talking about sort of reasons and causes and grounds and all of this varied philosophical terminology that's going to turn up later. But roughly what they're trying to get at is a kind of explanatory ground of this sort of unified set of persistent dynamics that we find ourselves in. And what they appeal to is substances in the sense of kinds of matter. So Thales most famously kind of basically begins philosophy by saying everything is water. They're saying, look, if you want to explain and understand this kind of persistent dynamic, you need to understand it through water, which is something we have an understanding of from a more kind of everyday conception. And Anaximenes will say this is wrong, and that actually the fundamental principle, the arche, is air. Right, that's what gives us the explanatory dynamic we're looking for. Heraclitus famously will say, rather than it being water or air, we should talk about fire. And in fact, he's far more explicit. Well, Heraclitus is rarely explicit, but you can kind of impute this to him. That fire really is just standing in for the very idea of change itself. So Heraclitus is very famous for thinking that everything is flux, and this is basically what he's getting at when he's trying to say that fundamentally we should understand the dynamics of the world in terms of fire. What's interesting about these three thinkers and these three different arche, I'm useful as a Greek, well, I'll try my best, is that they're all mass nouns. So you don't talk about 1, 2, 3 waters or fires or airs. You just talk about air as a kind of undifferentiated, quantifiable mass, but it doesn't break down into, say, well, what Aristotle will end up calling substances, like 1, 2, 3 apples or 2 dogs, or the mass nouns that they're using don't yet accommodate number, and so an idea of division within in a discrete body. So within these kind of principles that they're positing, there is this kind of attempt to capture the idea of physis as a totality, right? But not as a totality that is a discrete set of individuality. And again, this will become more important later. Now, the sort of really important, I think, the beginning of the system esti, being. Um, um, and in doing so, what he's trying to do is to strip away from the various kind of particular determinations or unitary principles that the previous pre-Socratics are trying to impute to nature, and just talk about their bare unity. He's trying to talk about whatever it is that all of them are talking about, without having to go via these particular kind of images that are familiar from other aspects of life. And in doing so, I mean, he ends up coming up with this sort of monism, in which sort of being is just understood as one. It's purely self-identical, and it's essentially identical with truth. What is true is just what is one, which is what it is. But in putting this forward, he introduces some kind of fundamental philosophical distinctions that will end up structuring the rest of the history of philosophy and metaphysics, especially. Crucially, he introduces these distinctions between being and becoming, or rather sort of formalizes that kind of twofold sense of physis as being about change and persistence. He introduces this distinction between thought and being. So he actually introduces the distinction between what we're talking about and the actual thought that's going on in talking about it. The actual process of engaging with it. Of course, he identifies thought and being, and ends up saying, well, not being can't be thought. We can't think anything that isn't, and so not being isn't. All there is being. But that initial kind of distinction before they're identified ends up being kind of the source of a huge problematic running through the whole history of philosophy. And crucially, like this is where kind of basically the whole problematic of idealism will come from. And finally, he introduces a distinction between truth and seeming. So fundamentally, Parmenides has this distinction between the way of truth and the way of seeming. These are the two halves of his poem in which we get his philosophy. And truth is just sort of the unitary one. There is ultimately what is true is just that there is one, that being is, and what appears is becoming and multiplicity. So you get this kind of association of being with unity and persistence, and becoming with seeming, which will sort of end up structuring a lot of philosophy as it gets adopted by Plato. So, how am I doing time-wise? Right. I'll try and speed this up. So, Socrates. We had the pre-Socratics, we get to Socrates. What we get with Socrates is the emergence of some kind of notion of essence. But we get it just implicitly within the famous question that Socrates asks everyone, which is TSD, what is? Socrates, will go up onto the street and ask someone, well, what is justice? And people will give him a list, well, this thing is just, and this thing is just, and this thing is just. No, I'm not interested in those things. I'm interested in justice itself. I'm interested in what justice, this thing that is common to all of these things, is. And that's kind of like the beginning of the Socratic tradition in philosophy, and it's this thing which will really kind of birth metaphysics through Plato and Aristotle. And this is kind of interesting because really Socrates himself doesn't have, I mean, if you kind of discount Plato's kind of subsequent systematization of Socrates and his kind of presenting his own thought through Socrates, I'd say that Socrates isn't particularly, from modern perspective, that much of a metaphysical thinker. Rather, the real things that concern Socrates, as opposed to the sort of pre-Socratics that we've talked about, as opposed to sort of those who are concerned with nature, is rather what the Greeks would call ethos. He's interested in ethics. He's interested in what today we tend to call normative questions rather than natural questions. So this is precisely what you see when Socrates is talking about, it's not just the fact that he's interested in essence, but what is the essence he's interested in. He's interested in justice, he's interested in virtue, he's interested in wisdom, he's interested in things which are fundamentally normative notions. And he has a kind of particular dialectical practice for concerning himself with them. What's interesting about Plato is that Plato essentially synthesizes Socrates' normative concerns with the natural concerns of the pre-Socratic. Sorry, one point I should make is that in saying that Socrates is interested in ethos, it's useful to make a distinction between ethos and nomos. Nomos being roughly law and culture, and what you get in some of the sophists is a certain kind of a very early relativism about the normative aspects of culture. And fundamentally, Socrates, one thing you can say about Socrates is when Socrates is interested in normative questions, he wasn't interested in normative questions as determined by culture. He did think that there was some kind of, if you want to use a term loosely, objectivity to normative questions, to what the essence of justice is, that some of the pre-Socratics the sophists would have disagreed with. So if you want to say that's a kind of metaphysical approach to ethics, maybe there is some kind of metaphysics in Socrates, but we'll see. What Plato does is to unify, as I've said, the sort of concern with physis in the pre-Socratics and the concern with ethos and the normative in Socrates, and to do so in a way that actually makes explicit the concern with essence that Socrates sort of introduces. And he does this by actually giving us a word, or giving the Greeks a word through which to think about these essences. In fact, there's two different words. There's ousia and hypokaimenon. And ousia is what ends up getting translated as substance, and hypokaimenon, also sometimes translated as substance, kind of unhelpfully, but is also translated as subject, literally as that which stands beneath. And that's subject not in the sense of subject as opposed to object, but subject in the sense of the subject that something is predicated of, or rather, say, the subject matter of a discussion. What it is that we're talking about, what lies behind our discussion. This is what I kind of meant when I said that you see how metaphysical concepts have to be kind of introduced out of more everyday ones. Hypokaimenon is literally a sort of constructed word, what stands beneath. But ousia comes from much more kind of everyday concerns in Greek. Ousia is actually kind of if I understand it correctly, is more to do with goods. It's to do with what people might call fixed capital. Someone who has ousia is someone who has sort of stable sources of wealth. So when Plato kind of in, for instance, the Meno, right, where he's trying to get Meno to talk about the ousia of something. He's trying to say, well, look, what's the substantial, what's the kind of the real wealth that lies beneath this, not the kind of passing kind of determinations of the thing, but what's the kind of I don't want to say real cash value, but I suppose that's a kind of a way of looking at it. Now it's important to kind of say that these concepts aren't quite determinate, and because fundamentally what Plato was concerned with ousia and hypokaimenon is eidos, or the ideas. He's interested in things like justice and wisdom and virtue, which are kind of normative ideas, but at the same time he's interested in like ideas relating to natural objects, so like the idea of man, the idea of water. These are meant to be kind of like the essences through which we comprehend the instances within the world, and crucially, this Plato thinks about this in terms of the distinction between sort of truth and seeming, or what comes to be the intelligible and the sensible, that he inherits from Parmenides. So the eidos, like the idea of man or the idea of water, is the real substance standing behind the individual men or the rivers and lakes within the world, right? It's that which persists across the becomings of these things within nature, and these becomings are fundamentally understood as seemings, not the reality of the ousia that lies behind. But the sort of real difference from Parmenides is that although the ideas are understood as I think it's auto-kathoto, so like they're understood as fundamentally changeless and sort of self-identical, persisting throughout these dynamics. There is nevertheless an important sense in which there's many of them, not just this kind of single one, which doesn't mean there isn't a unitary principle in Plato. Fundamentally, the idea of the good ends up being the kind of unitary ground of the whole sort of intelligible realm of ideas, and through that, the ground of all of the particular things, the becomings and seemings within the world that participate within those ideas. And this is defined as the good beyond being. Now I'll say one last thing about that. What's interesting about this idea of the good as the fundamental ground of nature is that the good is the fundamental normative notion. If anything, it's that which defines the normative, understood as kind of the study of value and what we should do and what we should think and what should be. So fundamentally, what Plato does is to ground nature upon the normative domain. And this has kind of very interesting consequences for just philosophy as it develops, because that'll be kind of sort of the key to the relationship between metaphysics and ethics, which, you know, fundamentally I think is problematic, but it's definitely there throughout the history of philosophy. Right. How long have I been talking for now, by the way? Tony?
On mute, sorry. You've been talking for about 40 minutes.
Okay, right. I'm going to have to kind of speed up. Sorry, guys, if any of this is boring because you know it already, it's just useful to kind of go through because some of these things will keep turning up. Right. Aristotle. This is where we get into the reading I set from Heidegger. With Aristotle, what we get is an actual differentiation of different philosophical tasks. And importantly, Aristotle does explicitly differentiate what he calls first philosophy or proto-philosophia. And it's this that will actually form the sort of historical core of metaphysics, because it's those books that constitute Aristotle's conception of first philosophy that get later categorized. And so it's important to understand what Aristotle thinks first philosophy is. And Heidegger, to say, traces this out of the original notion of physis, and he separates out a concern with beings as such and beings as a whole. So that means beings qua beings, you know, beings understood in their essence as beings, and beings understood as a totality, as this kind of this whole of nature. Aristotle says that first philosophy is about these two things. One of Heidegger's fundamental criticisms of Aristotle will be that he doesn't actually connect these two things properly, even though Heidegger does think they are connected. The other thing I should say is that the way Aristotle goes about proto-philosophia is through this term which really kind of sort of came about in Parmenides, this idea of being. Fundamentally, what Aristotle will point out is that being is said in many ways. So he defines like 4 different kind of senses of being. I think they're being in the sense of being true, being in the sense of the categories, which are his fundamental, being in the sense of potentiality and actuality, and being in the sense of substance. And he'll try to basically put together his first philosophy in terms of how these different senses relate, which he does in terms of articulating the primary sense through which he is to be understood, and this is being as substance. But fundamentally, the notion of substance that, and this is, the Greek word is ousia, that we found coming out of sort of implicit within Socrates and actually explicitly named in Plato, undergoes a shift in Aristotle. So Aristotle is kind of interested in what fundamentally lies behind, you know, as I've said, hypokaimenon. But he will, as it were, kind of deepen the concern beyond Plato, insofar as he will say that, well, fundamentally what lies behind is what lies behind itself. As to say, those things, whatever they are, that are not predicated of other things, but which things are predicated of. So rather than concerning himself with ousia in the sense of like the essence of justice, or the essence of man, or the essence of, or the idea of water, or whatever these various things are, these will become secondary substances that have to be understood in terms of the things, the individuals in which they are instantiated. Which is to say, you know, Pete or Fido or whatever things you want to name. And this introduces a kind of a sort of fourfold distinction between what ultimately becomes essence and accident, and particular and universal. Sorry, individual and universal. So individuals are fundamentally those things that have essences, which is to say, those things that can remain what they are across changes, which is to say, across various different accidents. So, you know, I can the fact that I'm wearing this particular T-shirt today is something which is kind of accidental about me. And the idea is that because Pete can be re-identified across different instances, right, means that Pete actually is something which stands behind those essences. Sorry, those accidents. So what is essential is what has essence in the sense of that which can persist across change. Now this is quite important ultimately. I mean, I'll explain this a little bit more when we come to Ian Grant's work, which hopefully I will get to. But one important thing to understand about this distinction between primary and secondary substances and essences and accidents is that primary substances as individuals are essentially things that can be counted in Aristotle. And this relates to what I was saying earlier about mass nouns with the PreSocratic. Water and air and fire aren't things that can be counted. They can be quantified, scientifically as we know at the moment. But this isn't to say you can count instances of them in the way that you can count men or dogs or teacups or apples. Substances in Aristotle are those things which are natural units. And this will end up being quite important insofar as Aristotle makes natural units primary, and this gives a kind of weird secondary status to those material dynamics that can't be understood in that way straightforwardly. Right. Now, two other important things that we get out of Aristotle. One is Aristotle formalizes a physics as opposed to a method. And this is accounted for the four causes. Material, formal, efficient, and final. And really those are kind of like two opposed pairs. You have this opposition between form and matter, and this is fundamentally between form as that which can actually be thought and understood through a secondary substance, and matter is that which is, it's merely instantiated in. So form is understood as actuality, matter is understood as potentiality, but really matter has no concrete potentiality whatsoever. Any actual potentiality, any particular possibilities always come from the thing having a particular form. The distinction between efficient and final causation, on the other hand, is just the distinction between what brings something about, the kind of temporal ground of something, and the end or the reason for which something has been brought about. And this is quite important because it's in this distinction between efficient and final causation that you see Aristotle's articulation of the relationship between the normative and the natural that was put together in Plato. In fact, I should say a little bit more about that. So in Plato, the ideas are understood not just as essences but as ideals. So the idea of man is simultaneously the perfect man. It gives you a certain way to judge deviation from an ideal or a goal or an end, which is implicit within the thing. Aristotle carries this along in the account of final causes. I'll talk about how that develops a little bit later. The final thing in Aristotle is the introduction of the idea of theology. And Heidegger talks quite a bit about this in the text I set. Crucially, what Aristotle does to unify the two sides of first philosophy, and Heidegger just takes this to be a kind of ad hoc unification, is to say that first philosophy is not just the study of beings as such and beings as a whole, but of the highest being, or that being, or I think the weird Greek translation is actually the most beingly being, that being to which being most properly belongs. And this is the deus, and this is the kind of fundamental basis for the theological conception of the divine and God that will come after. And the particular way he thinks about God or the deus is, insofar as it's that most beingly being, it's pure form. It's completely without matter. It's immaterial. Which is to say, it's kind of pure actuality. He thinks this as thought thinking itself. God is thought thinking itself, and that's the sense in which it's pure form, right? Pure actuality comprehending itself. And then finally, he thinks it as the prime mover, which is to say, both the ultimate efficient and final cause. So God is both that which sets nature in motion and the reason for which everything is supposed to follow its final cause. God sets up a kind of hierarchy of ends in terms of which all of the different things within nature are supposed to follow their particular dynamics. It's sort of useful to say that when we talk about movement and motion within Aristotle, motion is not yet what we think of as motion within contemporary physics. It's not change of position, but change more generally. So what kind of distinguishes physics as opposed to metaphysics in Aristotle is that physics is the study of motion, which is just to say it's the study of change. It's the study of becoming as opposed to being in itself, which is to be understood as like that which persists through becoming. Right. But fundamentally, the other thing, well, the final point about Aristotle is simply that if Plato sort of treats the normative as something which can be thought in and of itself beyond being, the idea of the good, and then grounds nature upon that, Aristotle kind of flips this round and ends up regrounding the normative upon being within metaphysics, or at least within a certain conception of the hierarchy of nature. And this is kind of clear from the way in which ethics is thought within Aristotle, because ethics is fundamentally understood as determined by the end of man. So man has a final cause, just like all of the other things within the world. So just as it's the purpose of the worm to be eaten by the bird. Fundamentally, it's the purpose of man to flourish, and the nature of this flourishing is what will be understood within the ethics, right? But the ethics as a kind of normative account of how we are supposed to act is fundamentally subordinated to an account of how we are supposed to be. How we are supposed to be as one thing within the order of nature, amongst others. Right. Okay. I'm not getting through this as fast as I should be, so I'm just going to skip out a bunch of stuff. One is What comes after Aristotle fundamentally is Neoplatonism. Neoplatonism is largely just a systematization of Plato. But interestingly enough, what it kind of does is to sort of, in systematizing Plato, to kind of make him more true to his Parmenidean origins, which is to the fundamental concept of Neoplatonism is the one. What it does is to systematize the way in which the one, which is now kind of thought as the good beyond being in Plato, emanates through various levels, through a kind of hierarchy of perfection, into the sensible world. Won't say anything more about it. Then we get scholasticism, and scholasticism is where, as opposed to Plato, Aristotle gets systematized. And this is where it gets systematized and synthesized with Christianity. And this is where metaphysics emerges, explicitly. So this is where first philosophy becomes metaphysics. And as Heidegger points out, it becomes metaphysics because first philosophy doesn't sit within the division of philosophy laid out by Plato students in the academy, which is this distinction between ethics, logic, and physics. First philosophy in Aristotle sort of almost looks like physics, but it's not quite physics. And this is why it gets characterized as terminator physica. It gets characterized as sort of coming after the physics. It's related to the physics, but not quite it. And that's just a kind of library classification. What happens within the sort of scholastic appropriation and development of Aristotle's ideas is that this term metaphysics gets given a kind of positive content. It gets understood not simply as what comes after physics, but that which deals with a subject matter that is beyond physics. It deals with a subject matter that is beyond nature. And it's beyond nature understood as, on the one hand, the actual concrete beings that are encountered within nature, for Aristotle, the primary substances, and as that which is beyond the sensible being kind of still associated with the sort of realm of becoming as opposed to the realm of being. And what Heidegger tracts is the way that this itself gets kind of further determined. So once metaphysics becomes concerned with a subject matter which goes beyond physics, it ends up being turned into a sub-discipline very much like physics or biology, in the sense of a discipline that deals with a particular region of beings. So whereas physics deals with those things which are natural and material, metaphysics gets understood as increasingly dealing with those things that are immaterial. Those things that are suprasensible. And the interesting thing is, and this is the other thing that Heidegger points out, is that this ends up conflating two different senses of the sensible, or two different things that can be opposed to the sensible. One which he calls the suprasensuous, and one which he calls the unsensuous. This is basically to say that what happens in scholasticism is those things that are suprasensuous in the sense of being immaterial, which gets associated with the idea of spirit or pure thought, which, if you remember, that's how God was understood in Aristotle's Theology, are conflated with the unsensuous, which are those things that are the most general formal determinations common to all things. So what you might want to call the kind of categorical notions, ideas like unity, equality, and opposition, that can be applied to everything, including the sensuous, but are not necessarily themselves sensuous. These two things get kind of conflated in scholasticism. Right. This gives way to modern philosophy. And in modern philosophy, the kind of particular concerns of scholastic metaphysics are maintained, particularly concerns with, say, the existence and nature of God and the immortality of the soul. Concerns with those things which have become like the issues that belong to this suprasensuous domain, right, are retained within modern philosophy. Where modern philosophy fundamentally diverges from scholasticism is that it inherits a conception of physics opposed to the Aristotelian conception of physics. Namely, it's concerned with the emergence of mathematical physics. And mathematical physics is precisely the thing that introduces this kind of restricted conception of motion, which is no longer simply all kinds of change, including kind of generation and decay, but is very specifically understood as change in position. Change in position of bodies that can be understood in terms of the mathematical description of extension. So these notions of bodies and extension are brought in through a kind of independent mathematization of physics that's occurred outside of the scholastic tradition. The other thing that characterizes modern philosophy, and this is something that Heidegger points out, is the development of the notion of the subject. And this is the subject not as sort of hyperkaimenon that we were talking about earlier, like subject as opposed to predicate, but subject as opposed to object. And this is interesting because although we've already seen that there is a certain distinction between thought and being running through the philosophical tradition coming from Parmenides, when thought has been understood in these various cases before, including in Plato in terms of like the idea and the intelligible, what is being talked about is fundamentally the structure or content of thought. Whereas what's introduced with the concern with the subject is the concern with the thinking, with the individual instances of thinking that content or relating to that structure. And you see this in Descartes and in Locke and in the development of empiricism, but that kind of emerges. That develops through Kant and German idealism, and I'll explain that a little bit more. I'd just like to go a little bit through okay, I'm going to run very quickly through Spinoza and Leibniz.
I just want to let you know you're at 1 hour.
I'm at 1 hour. Okay.
Just keep you.
Bloody hell. I'm sorry, guys, for trying to cram so much into one space.
It's very good. So. Thank you.
I just want to give us a kind of good base for thinking about how all of these notions evolve. Okay, Spinoza and Leibniz. So the first thing to understand here is that Descartes fundamentally changes the way in which the notion of substance is thought. So we've tracked the notion of substance through sort of the emergence of the idea of essence in Socrates, the introduction of ousia in Plato, its kind of association with primary substance and individuals within Aristotle, and that's fundamentally how substance is understood throughout the scholastic tradition. In Descartes, this idea of standing behind gets translated into a certain conception of independence, this kind of in-itselfness. Substance is what subsists in itself without needing to be determined by other things. So it's not just that it's no longer that which isn't said of other things, that which is the kind of subject to the predicate, it's that which is fundamentally kind of persisting in and of itself, not just a cross-determination. And this is why kind of Descartes can distinguish between the thinking substance and an extended substance, because they can be thought independently, they can be thought as in themselves. Spinoza and Leibniz take up this determination in two different ways, but they both fundamentally think about substance as that which is kind of fundamental in the sense of in itself. The the way in which this diverges is that Spinoza ends up thinking that there can only be a single substance. If you distinguish between substance is that which is self-causing and modes as those things which are caused by other things, then there can only be one self-causing substance as far as Spinoza is concerned. Interestingly enough, there are, the actual argument for this is, much more complicated than I would like to go into. But there's a kind of side argument that Spinoza presents for this, which is that he says that the concept of a thing can never determine directly the number of those things. He says the concept of dog, won't determine whether there's 1, 2, 3, or 14 dogs. That number is just entirely contingent and extrinsic to it. The only number that could be determined by a concept would be singular. Would be like if it's internal to the concept of something that it is self-generating. The only kind of thing it could have would be unity rather than kind of any sort of plurality. Interestingly enough, Leibniz's answer to that is that there is another number of things that could be determined by the concept of thing, and that's infinity. What you get with Leibniz and the concept of monads is infinite substances. Infinite fundamental substances that persist eternally, but which are the subjects to which different things are predicated. Okay. The other fundamental thing to talk about in Spinoza and Leibniz, because it will become important later on, is Spinoza and Leibniz are the real thinkers of the principle of sufficient reason. So I mentioned earlier how really the notion of kind of ground and cause is something that isn't really kind of completely determined in the Greeks, with the kind of the notion of arche, for instance. There's a certain explanatory connection, but it's not really differentiated. What you get within Spinoza and Leibniz is a more kind of definite conception of cause, understood in terms of reason, or reason, so something being a reason for something else. And you get a parallelism of reasons and causes. In Spinoza distinguishes between immanent and efficient causation, which are fundamentally distinguished in terms of time. So efficient causation is something coming before something else. 1 billiard ball hitting another, and that being the reason why that billiard ball is moving over there. Right? You have this kind of chain of temporal causes. But equally, he thinks you have immanent causes. And again, the way this is understood is in terms of reasons, which is to say, you might want to say that the particular path that billiard ball takes when it's hit over there is determined by the laws of mechanics, and the laws of mechanics don't determine it by being prior to it. They are immanent in that they are fundamentally traced through the attribute of extension and to the substance of God. God kind of immanently causes these sort of persistent and constant structures which structure the dynamics of becoming. So again, we keep getting that kind of opposition between persistence and change. Now, what both Leibniz and Spinoza need is for there to be, if, as they say, there is a reason for everything, right? What that implies is that, A, there needs to be an actual ground of everything. There needs to be an actual cause causing every additional cause. So there needs to be this kind of chain of causation running back, which they think can only be ended by a first cause, right? Either immanently or efficiently, and that is, God, and that there needs to be a chain of reasons explaining why this, and there needs to be a chain of reasons paralleling the chain of causes. right? Which means fundamentally that that infinite list of causes needs to be able to be comprehended, and they ground its comprehensibility, its intelligibility within God as well. So God is not just the first cause in each case. God comprehends the full range of causes, and thus establishes that there is an intelligible reason for everything that is. Right. What's interesting about this, and this is quite explicit in Spinoza. In Spinoza, you have, substances split between at least the attributes of thought and extension. The attribute of thought contains this kind of like this chain of reasons, this chain of ideas, which parallels the chains of causes in extension. Fundamentally, what you have there is the structure of thought, the structure of intelligibility being kind of ingrained within the world itself, which is the sort of thing you will get in German idealism. But people tend to think of idealism as being something which comes later than Spinoza and Leibniz. Really, there is an idealism here, but it's not opposed to anything like a realism, insofar as they think that these ideal structures of thinking are part of the structure of reality itself. Anyway, right. Oh man. Okay. Kant, and then I'm going to skip. Now, I mentioned earlier that as opposed to how he's often understood, Kant isn't anti-metaphysics. Kant just wants to delimit metaphysics, which is to say, to distinguish between those metaphysical questions we can actually answer and those which we can't. So, for instance, one of the ones I started with is there a beginning or end in time? Does God exist? Kant thinks that these questions just can't be answered. And he does this by basically trying to provide an account of knowledge, provide an account of the subject of knowledge and the conditions of its possibility that enables him to distinguish between that knowledge which is possible, knowledge from experience, and that knowledge which is impossible, that which isn't grounded in experience. Right? But you can still do metaphysics as a certain kind of a priori description of the structure of the world as it appears. However, this kind of limitation okay. Let me introduce one more point. So there's this idea of suprasensibility, that which is beyond the sensible, has been with us since sort of Plato, in this distinction between the intelligible and the sensible, and if not further back. What Kant does is to actually split it, so that you get two distinctions which replace it. On the one hand, you get this distinction between phenomena and noumena, which is between things in the world as it appears to us and things in themselves. And on the other hand, he introduces this distinction between sensibility and understanding. So between sensations, between the senses and the intellect. And what this actually does is to distinguish between sort of within intellection and thought, between what you might want to call the concept and the idea. Right? Concepts are concepts of phenomena. They are ways of sort of categorizing generally the phenomena that appear in experience. Whereas in Kant, ideals govern the exercise of reason itself and can potentially be projected beyond experience. They shouldn't be, but they can be. And the question of delimiting metaphysics is the question of trying to bring back the ideas into their appropriate usage, rather than seeing them as being belonging to the suprasensible itself. The exception to this is that Kant thinks that that in their practical usage, in the use of practical reason, we are essentially unlimited. We aren't limited by the sort of phenomena-numina distinction, and that in this case, practical reason is autonomous. It legislates for itself. It doesn't need anything from experience to determine its kind of own laws. And this is important because what it does is to fundamentally reverse what Aristotle did in articulating the relationship between nature and normativity in his account of final causation. So if you think that in Aristotle, the normative in the sense of what we should do is subordinated to the normative sense of what we should be, like what our role within the order of nature is. In Kant, what we should do becomes autonomous. It becomes not something which is derived from any empirical understanding or even metaphysical understanding of nature in itself. It becomes something that reason gives to itself. This doesn't mean that Kant has no conception of the alternative kind of normativity, ought to be rather than ought to do. And this is what he introduces in the critique of teleological judgment. And what Kant does there is he basically says that ought to be's or functions or teloses, right? So say the function of my heart is to pump blood around my body, right? Those things which were traditionally understood as Aristotelian final causes, as kind of inherently part of reality, are in fact just regulative principles enabling us to understand how reality functions. How these causal systems function. We can't understand them as having a kind of causality that belongs to reality itself. And the way we understand this is through analogy with practical reason. So through analogy with ought to do's, we understand that we can understand that my heart is supposed to pump blood around my body because it has the same kind of form as that I am not supposed to kill, or that if I want to go to the shops, I better find my keys, or these kinds of practical norms are the kind of model for functional norms. Right. That distinction between what you call mechanistic causality, so which is sort of like purely efficient causality, but thought on the model of mathematical physics that you find in Kant, and teleology, the kind of the structure of organism. And so mechanism versus organism is really, really important for what comes after, important for Schelling and Ian Grant's work. What I'm going to do is just completely skip ahead and kind of ignore any additional metaphysicians I was going to talk about, and very, very briefly just discuss correlationism before moving into speculative realism. Is everybody okay so far? Has this been at all, has this made sense?
Yes.
Okay. I know I've tried to go in a bit too much detail, I'm sorry, but hopefully it'll help eventually. Now, what I mentioned earlier is that it's the Kant's introduction of this distinction between the phenomenal and the noumenal that kind of generates correlation. But it's not just that distinction between the phenomenal and the noumenal, but it's association with distinction between the sensibility and understanding. Because fundamentally what Kant does is to give us an account of intelligibility, that the conceptual, that is distinguished from the structure of the things in themselves. Now interesting about this particular account is that the thing in Kant that makes phenomena different from phenomena is sensibility. It's the fact that we have a particular form of sensibility. Things are given to us in terms of a peculiar form of space and time, right? That separates us from things in themselves. Kant's quite explicit that there could be other forms of sensibility, right? But what he doesn't think is that there could be other forms of conceptuality. This isn't to say that different people can't have different concepts, or that aliens, if we met them, and Kant did actually believe in aliens, funnily enough, couldn't have different concepts, but rather the structure of the conceptual, which he calls the categories, would necessarily be the same across them. So for Kant, there still is a kind of universal structure of intelligibility. It's just the universal structure of intelligibility is contained within the subject as a kind of condition of the possibility of having a subject that can know things, right? What separates its knowledge of appearances from things in themselves is this kind of these parochial forms of sensibility which stand in between. Now, Museu will characterize Kant as a weak correlationist, because although Kant thinks we can't know things in themselves, we can think things in themselves beyond sensibility. And what we can think about them is, namely, basically their structure as something at all, which is to say that they exist and that they're non-contradictory. Right? Those are the two things Kant thinks we can know about being itself, and we can know it fundamentally because those are like the conditions of thinking it as something at all. What you get in the 20th century, so I'll gloss entirely over German idealism, if only to say that what German idealism is famous for is getting rid of the noumenal. Right, the German idealism isn't correlationism, right? It just reimputes the structure of thought into being, just now thought using the kind of tools that Kant has provided, right? What happens in the 20th century is that this correlationism, this weak correlationism that turns up in Kant, evolves. And it evolves into what Museu calls strong correlationism, which is basically the idea that even the minimal notions of existence and non-contradictoriness of the things in themselves can't be known. We can't even know that about. Those themselves are just kind of artifacts of our thinking, which are projected upon reality. Now, what I'll do is I'll just kind of I'll skip over the discussion of the details of correlationism. Right? It's useful to kind of give a few examples, namely Husserl, the early Wittgenstein, the early Wittgenstein, that which we cannot speak of, that of which we cannot speak, we just pass over in silence. And Carnap in the analytic tradition, Heidegger followed by Derrida in the continental tradition. There is this whole kind of proliferation of strong correlationism throughout the beginning of the 20th century, and it begins in a similar position to Kant, trying to provide a certain kind of universal description of the structure of thought, but ultimately gives way in, say, the late Heidegger and Wittgenstein into the idea that there is no such thing as a single structure of thought, just like in Kant there is no such thing as a single structure of sensibility. There's no one form of sensibility. And it's this fact that there is a plurality of, be it, cultures, languages, language games, forms of biology, whatever kind of particular conditions you want to talk about. It's the fact that there is a plurality of that which prevents us from thinking the in itself. We only get the world as given to us through these conditions, and that includes notions like existence and non-contradiction. Right, Tony, how am I doing?
You're coming up on your 1.5 hour mark if you wanted to do the cutoff.
Okay,
about
right.
4 minutes until that.
I just want to very, very quickly start talking about speculative realism and about Ian Grant and Brassier. I'll try and make this as quick as possible, and then we can get into discussion.
If we do that, we'll have an hour to have a discussion at least. So.
Yeah. I'm going to be less ambitious in future, I promise. Okay.
That's really good. It's really good. So.
Right, well, okay. So, speculative realism begins with this identification of this correlationist trend that runs from Kant through the 20th century by Museu, particularly focusing on correlationism in continental philosophy. And if there was kind of one name you pick out Heidegger and the influence of Heidegger. Now, all of the other figures, or the three other figures, Harman, Brassier, and Grant, what unites them is their opposition to this, and their attempt to say something about reality independently of those various different kinds of conditions, be they biological, cultural, linguistic, that supposedly prevent us from getting to it. But what they're actually concerned with in terms of trying to describe reality and how they go about it is quite different. So what you find in, I'm going to talk about Harman next week, what you find in Museu and Brassier and Grant, and this is what you'll have seen in the reading, is a concern with the relationship between metaphysics and science that has been kind of elided within large swathes of the continental tradition. Again, Heidegger is the kind of culprit here. In Museu, he's particularly concerned with the tractability of mathematical description upon nature, of explaining why it is that nature is so amenable to mathematical description, which is to say, basically, why it is that the Galilean paradigm, which kind of kicked off mathematical physics, and simultaneously birthed modern philosophy and its metaphysics, is workable. Brassier is concerned with this as well, but he's more specifically concerned with cognitive science and our ability to describe our own place as thinkers within nature. And Grant is concerned even more than with the sort of scientific approach to thought, or the approach to the mathematical science in general. He's concerned with the content of the sciences and trying to break down the barrier between metaphysics and physics that he thinks was kind of illegitimately created by Aristotle, and which was kind of cemented by the mathematization of physics, and the way that ended up creating modern philosophy as it is. What I'd like to do is just to say a bit more about Grant's idea, because it feeds into the whole narrative I've been telling. In fact, the kind of whole purpose of this narrative is to try and sort of make sense of what Ian is doing. So basically, Ian is interested in going back to nature, going back to physis, right? And physis prior to the way in which it comes to be articulated within Aristotle and within the scholastic metaphysical tradition that kind of formalizes and systematizes Aristotle's ideas. And there are, he sees this as kind of championing Plato over Aristotle. I don't necessarily agree with all of his reading of Plato, but you'll kind of be able to see how his reading makes sense, insofar as the crucial thing that happens in Aristotle is the prioritization of individuals. And Ian will talk about this in terms of bodies, in terms of like material bodies that have extension, which is really kind of something which is the development of Aristotle through mathematical physics and Galileo. But there's definitely a truth to the idea that what Aristotle does is to make the cosmos principally into individuals, and individuals that are undergoing change, right? And this fundamentally breaks with the conception of the dynamic, right, that was implicit within the kind of the idea of nature from which the pre-Socratics began, and which Plato took up. Right? In Plato, what you have is again the realm of becoming as the realm of kind of dynamics, without privileging necessarily individuals that can be discretely counted as natural. So you don't just have particular things that can be discretely counted, but you also have puddles of water, storms. You have various different processes and amounts and quantities of matter undergoing dynamic changes, which can't be understood in terms of a subsystem essence and its accidental transformations. So what Ian wants to go back to is to revert from this Aristotelian conception to a notion of nature, but he's also concerned, again through Schelling, with the idea of this nature as a whole, as a totality. This is something else that we saw was already there within the pre-Socratics, this kind of prevailing of beings as a whole. And in doing so, he takes up, again, along with Schelling, this association between this idea of identity, this idea of nature as that which is self-identical and unconditioned. But the way in which he does this is through not just prioritizing dynamics over somatics, or dynamic processes over individuated bodies, but prioritizing the notion of process, or the process of production, over the products that are produced. And he thinks this in terms of the relationship between ground and grounded. Right? And this is fundamentally a temporal conception. And so nature as a whole gets thought of as that self-identical, unconditioned totality that is the ground of all of the dynamics through which the various different particular individual products within nature are produced. And in fact, I can't remember if this is in the reading, but this comes out of Schelling. because nature is not itself thought of as an entity, as an individual, and this kind of correlates with the pre-Socratic conception of the arche in terms of mass terms rather than in terms of individuals. It can't be thought as a ground, but has to be thought of as what gets called the abground. It's like an unground. It's a primordial, primitive ground. Two more points about Ian Grant, and then I'm just going to go into discussion. And I apologize for running over. The two more points about Ian Grant is that he doesn't just take up this idea of Aristotle, of Plato against Aristotle, by trying to kind of locate the structure of by trying to kind of prioritize the dynamic over the semantic. He also champions Plato against Kant. So what I said about Kant's conception of the ideas is that fundamentally they don't have applicability to the supersensible. Whereas Schelling, and Grant follows him in this, tries to kind of recuperate the idea from Plato and to locate it within the structure of nature itself as the actual ground, the cause of the dynamics within nature. It's the actual structure, the actual intelligible structure that is thought in the thing which causes the actual dynamics within nature. So he tries to think of ideas as generative rather than as transcendental conditions. Or as the kind of, again, in a sort of Parmenidean way, the self-identical, which persists through as the actual cause of becoming. The final point to make about Schelling, and again, this is something which comes out of reading, is that in Aristotle, we have this distinction between efficient and final causation. Kant redetermines this in his account of the distinction between sort of mechanistic causation and the organic. Kant treats the organic as fundamentally analogous to practical reason. But what he leaves us with is essentially this kind of, at least according to Grant, he leaves us with this kind of vast gap between physics, the science of kind of bodies in motion, and biology. And what Grant's concerned with is the idea that, well, basically, where have sciences like chemistry and geology gone? Grant is concerned with the idea that in fact there are more forms of organization in the dynamics of nature, right, than those we find within the biological realm that can supposedly be thought by analogy with practical reason. This kind of breaks both with the sort of Kantian and Aristotelian models, insofar as it tries to find a sort of more general science of dynamics that breaks with the sort of simplistic conception of bodies in motion, and breaks with the sort of artificial conception of organic life as sort of practically purposive. Right. I'm just going to stop there. I apologise for trying to squeeze too much in. But let's have an hour of discussion, and hopefully we can try and bring out the sort of issues in the reading with Brassier and Grant, and just general topics about speculative realism and how it relates to this sort of history of metaphysics I've been going through, by discussing it amongst ourselves. This is the first time we've done this, and I can see everybody's still muted. Tony, is it a good idea for us to unmute everyone, or is that going to be?
Yeah, for discussion, we can all unmute,
Okay.
and then if you notice that you're feeding back, sometimes I'll be managing it. I can manage everybody, so if there's feedback or something, I might mute you, but don't take it personal.
So first of all, let's just kind of bring in any kind of crucial thoughts or questions, and just general topics about speculative realism and how it relates
Hold on.
this metaphysics I've been going.
Okay. So I was wrong, Mo. I'm sorry. If you come in with the YouTube video, it will echo.
So okay, when everybody gets unmuted and we can talk, let's just start with some kind of matters arising. So any kind of like fundamental questions, and then we can talking about Grant and Brassier and speculative realism and how that relates to all this. So
the floor is open for questions, right?
yeah.
People might want to unmute themselves and ask a question, because that's how you enter the discussion at this point. Tony has muted all of you, so you don't add feedback and stuff to the recording, but you can unmute yourself on top of the screen and then ask a question if you have any questions. I have lots, but I'm just going to take a seat back and allow other questions to flow.
Peter, I just have this question that I still haven't got it very clear. Is what's the difference between noumenon and phenomenon, like in a really broad sense, if it's possible?
No, it's a great question. I mean, there are obviously lots of interpretational quibbles that people have around this, but here's my take on it. I think that the essence of the distinction in Kant is a sort of epistemological one. The noumenon is a kind of meant to be a sort of limit concept, which fundamentally delimits what we can't know about things. So it doesn't have any kind of substantive metaphysical content. It's just defined in terms of its unknowability, right? And that unknowability is understood simply in terms of its inaccessibility to sensation. The fact that any interaction we have with it is fundamentally filtered through the forms of sensibility. So this makes a bit more sense when you ask, well, what's the phenomena then? Well, for Kant, phenomena are everything that we encounter within the world, everything that we're familiar with, the objects that populate our experience. My laptop in front of me is a phenomena, right? It's not, the phenomena aren't sensations, right? Sensations or intuitions. Phenomena are the actual objects that have been synthesized from my sensations and my kind of conceptual understanding, so that objects have kind of a logical structure. They are unitary substances that have certain kinds of properties that can be predicated of them, as well as having kind of sensual content. Fundamentally, Kant thinks that experience has the structure of judgment. Like when a judgment, like my laptop is matte and aluminium, right? Is the actual kind of phenomena I encounter has the judgmental structure. That's the so the world as we experience it is just the phenomenon is just what is appropriate to sort of empirical description, and the the noumenal is just kind of whatever it is underlies that which cannot be in principle described in that way. Does that make any sense? Does that help?
Yes, definitely. So, in noumena, what would be the main difference between noumenon and metaphysics? Because metaphysics also treats things that are not part of experience itself, right?
Well, this is the thing: is that when Kant was defining the noumenon, he was very much doing it in terms of this scholastic tradition, which had defined metaphysics' purview as the suprasensible, right? So for Kant, like precisely the things we can't know about are the things which scholastic metaphysics concerned itself with most ardently, namely the existence of God and the immortality of the soul. These things are just like, right, we can't know about them because they're suprasensible. So this is what's interesting, is that in Kant, but this is partly why people think that Kant is anti-metaphysics. It's just that he changes what the purview of metaphysics is. Metaphysics is, in his account, restricted to describing the structure of the world we can experience, which fundamentally is kind of guided by the description of the a priori structures through which we constitute that experience. Now, I mean, I'll talk about this in later sessions. I think that there's a kind of a slight flaw in Kant, or not a flaw, but there's a slightly more substantive conception of the noumenon, which comes in the account of freedom, where he starts talking about noumenal causation. Like we have to think of ourselves as being kind of self-caused by whatever it is we really are, rather than by chains of mechanistic causality which we can understand within the experienced phenomenal world. And this kind of noumenal causality gives the noumenon a certain kind of weird substantive metaphysical content, or it imputes it to it that, and this ends up being kind of the beginning of a more sort of substantive conception of the noumenal, which becomes almost like positive metaphysics of the suprasensible in later thinkers. So I mean, you definitely see this in Schopenhauer, for instance. Like Schopenhauer has a metaphysical account of the noumenal, which is, you know, the world is will itself. But it's a kind of a sort of positive metaphysics of the suprasensible that develops through other thinkers as well. You'll find this in, everyone from let's say Schopenhauer, Schelling, and I would argue to some extent in Museu and Zizek, and also in Museu, weirdly enough, but in a slightly different way. Anyway, I don't know if that's any more helpful. Is there any other questions?
I have one on Museu. I've never done this. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
I was wondering if, so this claim that something that can be found mathematically in Museu can be closer to the thing in itself or be the thing in itself. I was wondering what the interest in the mathematically verifiable and the intersubjectively communicable afterwards has to do with his materialism per se, or speculative materialism, and how that became speculative realism.
I'll go in kind of reverse order, and at this point, like, I think people should feel free to kind of chirp in if you want. I know I haven't given you enough time to talk, so but going in reverse order, the speculative realism conference was originally supposed to be called speculative materialism, but wasn't because Graham Harman rejects materialism. However, the word materialism itself is actually quite vague, and it's particularly vague, for instance, in the way that it could cover both, say, Ian Grant and his sort of idealist materialism. I mean, Ian Grant, you can say, is both a speculative idealist and a speculative materialist, and Museu's materialism. I mean, Museu's materialism is largely, he largely uses the word materialism to contrast himself with idealism. So, again, the senses in which they're being used, the crucial thing is that what Museu doesn't mean with materialism is he does not have any kind of positive account of matter. Like, it's not a kind of metaphysical prioritization of the notion of matter in any way, shape, or form. Just to kind of sort of explain a little bit more about Museu's view of the universe. Museu has this kind of weird conception of so if we think of, I was talking about like physis, this kind of like complete totality which is responsible for, all of the dynamics of nature or whatever. In Museu, the corresponding principle is what he calls hyperchaos or surchaos. And fundamentally, this is he also calls it absolute time. It's basically that which can disrupt and change absolutely anything which is. Right? But out of this emerge particular worlds. And world is like, it's an odd word, I think, for this. But he talks about the world of matter, the world of life, and the world of thought. So he thinks that kind of like out of sort of pure chaos emerges matter. Out of pure chaos, on top of this is as a supplement is life, and on top of that as a supplement is thought. And then in a certain sense, these are kind of ex nihilo in relation to each other. So already this sounds like nothing like any other kind of materialism you'd normally think of. Particularly because, as I say, like life in a certain sense in Museu has almost nothing to do with matter. Like, matter is a precondition for it, but it is kind of completely emergent and separate from it.
So would you say what he's doing is metaphysical? I mean, if you're talking about the necessity of contingency, like, is that still in the domain of metaphysics?
Oh yeah, I mean, Museu would not use the word metaphysics. But the reason he wouldn't use the word metaphysics is something I'm going to go into in the third lecture. It's because metaphysics, since Heidegger, has had a kind of pejorative sense associated to it. So, people go, oh, that's metaphysics. Or worse, that's metaphysics of presence. Right? I'm interested in something else. I'd say, and particularly if you look at like these worlds that Museu talks about emerging, right? He'll talk about, like matter, life, thought, and then ultimately justice. Actually, he ends up recreating basically the map of scholastic philosophy. Like, he ends up recreating kind of like an account of sort of metaphysica specialis as sort of physics and biology and cosmology and ultimately theology, right? So there's an important sense of in which Museu is like really, really classically a metaphysician, more so than many of the others, I think. But just to kind of connect this back to the account of mathematics, what you've got to think is that basically what these worlds are domains in which entities can appear with certain kinds of qualities. So they're simultaneously kind of certain kinds of types of thing and kinds of quality these things can have, and basically what the applicability of mathematics is as it were the more abstract structure of there being things and qualities that things can have at all. Mathematics ends up being the kind of the general structure of possibility as such, and then these worlds end up being concrete ranges of possibilities that are stacked on top of one another.
Right.
Does
Cool.
that make sense?
Yeah, definitely. Thank you.
Pete, I think Nushin has a question. Is that correct?
Hello. You talked about the relationship between metaphysics and physics and its relation to ethics and justice. I was wondering, how do you see the relationship between metaphysics and politics? Does it exist a little bit in all of the above, or how do you see the relationship between the two?
Well, I raised it as a question because, again, it's something which is definitely has kind of like the question of whether metaphysics and ethics, for instance, are kind of related, has a long kind of history. Personally, I'm with Kant, and I think that basically, I personally think that metaphysics is something to do with the description of nature, and I don't think the normative has any space within nature. I think, if you want to put it in somewhat kind of crass terms, the normative has no being. Now, this kind of so my way of putting it would be to say that ethics and metaphysics are two distinct parts of philosophy, and that neither is grounded in the other. As opposed to, say, Aristotle, for whom we understand the source of say, ethical or political norms in terms of the metaphysical nature of man and fundamentally God and the order that God gives to the universe within which man plays a role. I just think that we have to understand the normative as kind of sui generis. Now, there's a certain kind of exception to this, which is, I've written about this elsewhere, and if you send me an email, I'll happily send you some links to what I've written. But the exception to this is that, particularly in the case of politics, our understanding of what to do politically, both in terms of the kinds of general rules and principles to adopt as a society, and how to enact certain projects and plans and engage in political endeavors, is constrained by our understanding of how the world is. So politics is something that takes place in nature, and so there's an important sense in which any kind of understanding of nature, so our scientific understanding of how things are in the world, is going to have an impact upon our understanding of how things should be and how we should bring them about. And in that sense, if metaphysics contributes to our understanding of nature and how it is, then there's a kind of indirect sense in which metaphysics contributes to to politics. And there's even a different indirect sense in which the claim that metaphysics has no hold on normative issues is not without value politically. So when you're going up against people who are trying to say draw political conclusions from theological premises, the seemingly negative claim that ethics of ethics is completely separate from metaphysics ends up having quite important consequences, which is no, you can't do that. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Feel free to disagree with me, by the way.
Yes, I will. No worries.
Hey, Peter, I have a question, and you alluded to it when the question was asked a minute ago, and you talked about the prioritization of matter in metaphysics. And so I've just read Lucretius on the nature of things last week.
Oh, God.
And I'm wondering can we think of metaphysics in material terms, drawing on the tradition that Lucretius gives us?
I'm not an expert on Lucretius, by the way. It's one of the reasons I left him and the atomists kind of completely out.
I wondered why you didn't mention them, but...
I mean, what I can say is that like, the very notion of matter is bound up in its development in the history of metaphysics. So I mentioned when I was talking that Aristotle, in its account of physics, draws this distinction between form and matter.
Right.
And that ends up being the basis of the account of God as immaterial and blah, blah, blah. But the interesting thing is that, as I say, Aristotle defines matter as pure potentiality and form as actuality. So matter can have any form, but in truth, because matter has like infinite potentiality, it has no concrete potential whatsoever. All actual concrete potentials, all concrete possibilities are supplied by form. And this is something that Ian talks about in his work, where he ends up saying that basically what Aristotle ends up doing is actually kind of turning physics into a sort of phenomenology, because in Aristotle the forms are very much the way things appear to us. They're and worse for Ian, they're the appearances of constituted individuals, right? They're the secondary substances in terms of which we see, concrete individuals. Mm-hmm. And what this seems to do, as far as Ian's concerned, is to strip matter of any actual dynamism. Matter doesn't have any dynamism, any concrete potential that could change and disrupt the ways in which we see and understand the actual general categories in terms of which we interpret things through simply encountering them.
But isn't there a way, can I just ask a question about what you just said, that it strips away any dynamism? I mean, isn't there a way to understand matter as being pure potentiality and always dynamic?
Well, rather, this is precisely what, and this is why, say, Ian's materialism is very, very different from, say, Museu's materialism.
Yeah.
Right. Ian's materialism is precisely an attempt to do this. He wants to develop an account of matter as kind of pure potentiality, which is not this kind of stale or abstract or fundamentally kind of vacuous potentiality, that you find in Aristotle.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the sort of thing that that you also find in Deleuze as well. Is his attempt to try and think of matter as actually having potentials which are not exhausted by some kind of overarching intelligible form.
Right.
Now, how that gets done is, it's tricky, because I think in both Ian's work and in Deleuze's work, this ties into sort of actual engagements with modern science and with what tends to be called sort of complexity theory, and ideas to do with the actual study of sort of deterministic chaos and the kinds of attractors that can be used to describe the dynamics of matter, through which sort of the more familiar constituted individual bodies we are familiar with are constituted.
Mm-hmm.
Now, whether or not you can see sort of precursors of that non-Aristotelian approach to matter in Lucretius is something I'm not entirely clear about. I mean, I know there is this kind of, there's this conception of contingency which is important in Lucretius, coming through the clinamen and whatnot, but there's a question as to whether or not that's a kind of extrinsic supplement to matter which is still conceived purely in terms of form, or whether that is meant to stand for a kind of pure potentiality of matter. I wouldn't want to make a judgment because I really don't know Lucretius.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, that's helpful. Thank you.
But yeah, I mean, Ian's work can, if you look at his book Philosophies of Nature after Schelling, or probably point you in the direction of some other stuff, I find it quite hard to read, but part of the reason going through the history like this was trying to kind of get in my head how he was trying to turn back the philosophical clock in this way, to try and see how certain decisions were made in, say, Aristotle and carried forward, that have determined how we think about physics and metaphysics.
Well, I would be interested in seeing where you would point me in terms of Ian's work.
Yeah. If anybody wants kind of recommendations for reading in relation to other things like this, just post questions on the course page, and I'll happily answer them. Again, I don't consider myself an expert in Ian's work, but because I'm not an expert in Ian's work, I tried to kind of bone up for this first session, and probably ended up boning up a bit too much in terms of historical basis for it. So anyway, if we've got any more questions, we can go through. If anybody has any particular questions for me, let's keep working through them. And if not, we can kind of try and get ourselves into a more kind of open discussion.
I have another question. Maybe you can help me to understand better what's the difference between the negative dimension and the positive dimension. I'm mentioning this because I'm reading the latest Zizek book. He mentions that dialectics remains negative, while only speculation is the highest positive dimension. So I always have problems with this, the negative and the positive, how they relate to each other.
I mean, I suppose the first thing we just say is that negative and positive, it's a useful oppositional pair that can be used all over the place. And I know there is a tendency, particularly in continental, there's this like long-running tendency in continental metaphysics coming out of Deleuze, or what I generally think of as being slightly poor readings of Deleuze, to talk about like the positive and the negative as like fundamental metaphysical forces, or as characterizations of kinds of metaphysics. You know, people will say, oh well, Hegel's metaphysics is all about the negative, and Deleuze's metaphysics is all about pure positivity. And there's a certain truth to that, but it actually is to do very specifically with certain accounts of the logic of negation and how we relate that to what else is going on in the metaphysics. So I just kind of put all of that kind of like heavy metaphysics of positivity and negativity to one side, and just try and see what's going on in this particular instance. And what I'd say is, it sounds like what we've got is a replay of the opposition between critical and the speculative. So I mentioned before, Kant creates this sort of critical term where the idea is to delimit the scope of possible knowledge, and that means fundamentally to allow there to be things on the other side of that limit that we just can't know. And that's a kind of negative gesture. It's a gesture where it's just like, look, no, we can't know. And the word speculative within the history of philosophy really kind of takes on a specific sense in opposition to this. So in German idealism, people will talk about speculative idealism rather than transcendental idealism or things like this, in order to indicate a philosophy that pushes beyond the sorts of critical barriers that Kant set up. So, Kant will kind of like negatively limit and say, well, we can't know about this, that, and the other. And those who style themselves as being speculative move beyond that and try and kind of say, no, we can answer all of these questions. We can kind of we can give positive answers rather than merely negative answers to this range of questions. And obviously that was the kind of sense that people were taking up in speculative realism, partly in relation to the connection between critique and correlationism in Kant, but also as a kind of like other connotation to it, which is just when people say the word speculative, you almost want to stick the adjective in front of it, wildly. Oh, it's just wildly speculative. There's a certain sense in which the speculative is kind of unconstrained, and people wanted to kind of, in giving the name speculative realism, it was meant to be like, this isn't your granddad's realism. This is kind of much more interesting and dynamic and kind of ambitious realism. Yeah, the word speculative is, it's got some different connotations, and you've got to be careful with it. But it's definitely positive in the sense of going beyond mere negative answers to certain philosophical or metaphysical questions. Does that help?
Yeah, it helps. I think it's kind of funny that the speculative and realism are put together, because on the other hand, like Lacan says that the real is an impossibility. So if you have like that Lacanian concept of the real and added to a speculative that have a positive dimension, it's like a dimension of impossibility. I don't know.
Well, I mean, Lacan, I said earlier that, like, I think the concept of the noumenal actually kind of develops through various different figures in the 20th century, and I'd say Lacan's account of the real, not that I'm an expert on Lacan, but certainly the way in which it's picked up by, say, Bourdieu and Zizek is very much an equivalent to the noumenal. It's this idea of a kind of constitutive limit within thought. In fact, I mean, I don't know how well people know Bourdieu, but I'm going to talk about Bourdieu a bit more in relation to a lot of the themes here in the third lecture. And what's interesting for Jew is that he's almost best described as being a weaker correlationist than Kant, because for the Jew, the in itself, the real, right, this kind of like internal limit to thought, can be understood. We can think more about it than merely its non-contradictoriness and its distance, right? Because we can think it through set theory. We can think it as pure multiplicity or inconsistent multiplicity. So, but it's still fundamentally this kind of limit that we have to subtract all kind of positive experiential sort of phenomenal engagement from in order to get to it. So it's still this kind of noumenal. So I mean, all I'd say is basically Lacan's use of the notion of the real and the way that gets picked up in Badiou and Zizek, and also the way it's used in, say, Laruelle. They use the real almost more in the sense of the noumenal than would be kind of associated with other metaphysicians. There are other metaphysicians for whom the real is something which is a positive object of knowledge rather than being like a negative limit upon knowledge. And I think that's what was supposedly meant by speculative realism-ish.
I think we have Brooker still hasn't asked a question if he wants to ask, or I think we have Justin, Schaffner, Yvette, and Victor. I know you guys would like to ask a question. I would like to open it up to one of you.
I have a quick question. I'm just wondering if, like, there's a way of historically rooting why speculative realism happened in the last decade. Like, it seems to me like pointing out this concept of correlationism and problematizing it right now is sort of interesting, because I feel like maybe it should have happened in the past, or hasn't happened in the past and it's been drawn out. I'm just curious of your perspective on that.
I mean, okay. I genuinely think that Museu's diagnosis of correlationism is really important and really worthwhile. If he gives us nothing else, I think that was actually really significant. And I think that's, again, if there's anything which had mileage in speculative realism, it's the concern with, like, explicitly taking up Museu's critique way of understanding how to relate to the recent philosophical tradition. And I think, crucially, correlationism is sometimes confused with idealism, and it's not. It's very important to, and I think that's actually why it's such an important concept, because it is distinct. Because, like, previously, okay, I don't know if you've had this experience, but previously in philosophy departments, you'll get people saying, "Oh, Wittgenstein is just an idealist." Like, no, he's not an idealist. Actually, like, if you compare it to like Hegel or Schelling, what's all to do with those people? They're idealists, right? But correlation is a perfect description of the later Wittgenstein and the kinds of sort of quietist philosophy that emerge out of it. So I think we all had a kind of loose understanding of correlationist philosophies before Museu. Museu just really put a perfect name on it and a perfect way of bringing it all together as something that could be analysed and, resisted. In terms of why this happened in the last 10 years, beyond Museu giving us this nice little name to organise around, I think the crucial thing is that there's been a sort of an underground resurgence of metaphysics within the continental tradition, basically coming out of Deleuze. There's always been metaphysicians. Like, even when anti-metaphysics is at its height, there are always metaphysicians in the background. So, you know, I didn't mention sort of like, so in the 20th century, we can talk about Bergson, Whitehead, Russell and Moore, actually at the beginning of the analytic tradition, are not correlationists. They're very much metaphysicians. There are, you know, and there are always people who are interested in, you know, Spinoza and Hegel, and you know, there are people who within the tradition are definitely metaphysicians. But it's safe to say a certain criticism of metaphysics, particularly as interpreted through Heidegger and kind of warped through Derrida, was dominant in the continental tradition. And it was dominant even while Deleuze started to become popular, even to the extent that, like, so like just as Deleuze has a tendency to get kind of like lumped in under, say, the label post-structuralism, people will say things like, you know, oh, post-structuralists don't believe in, you know, reality, you know, blah, 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 or whatever. They come up with various different characterizations of post-structuralism, none of which apply to Deleuze. You know, people were able to kind of interpret Deleuze in an anti-metaphysical way. But as the sort of scholarship on Deleuze became better, his connections to, say, Bergson, Nietzsche, his kind of opposition to Heidegger and things like this became more clear, people started to take seriously that he was a pure metaphysician, in his own words. And the second thing that happens here is that Badiou's work, similarly, again, it has legitimate connections to Heidegger, and I'll explain this in the third lecture. But nevertheless, it connects to certain classically metaphysical topics that meant it had a lot more in common with Deleuze's work than it did with a lot of very kind of like strong correlationist stuff being done within continental philosophy and like the dominant tradition. So what I'd say is, like, what you get is this kind of, over the last sort of, I don't know, 20 years, you get this kind of dialogue between Deleuze and Badiou, which starts letting in engagements with, you know, metaphysicians who've been ignored, like Bergson, and the real kind of like metaphysical aspects of Hegel, rather than the sort of post-metaphysical Derridean accounts of Hegel and this, that, and the other. And what you get is this kind of like rumbling away of renewed interest in genuine metaphysical questions. And speculative realism, one of the reasons it was so popular, basically, is it was a kind of a coming out party for this stuff. It was like a, you know, it was like a, finally the elephant in the room has been revealed, and we're interested in talking about the structure of reality again. It was a kind of announcement of something that had already been going on. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. That was very helpful. I didn't think to understand it in that sort of like stream from Deleuze and looking back to Bergson and Whitehead. It's really helpful.
So guys, oh.
I want to open it up to perhaps Victor. Maybe one last question, unless Yvette has one, or.
I mean, I just like, if Victor, do you have a question?
Can people hear me?
I can hear you. Yes.
Okay. Right. Sorry. This is very quiet. I have a question, but it's a very big question. So perhaps this is not the time for a very big question. But it had to do with things you said at the very beginning on how, you know, you have to put a history of metaphysics in relation, like in a wider context. Too complicated for now.
Feel free to put it on the course webpage board. The other thing I'd say is, for those who are actually signed up for the course, I want people to write a kind of 500-word thing within the next week. But anybody else who wants to can. And I encourage people to kind of, if you put that on the course board, then people can comment on each other's writing. So I'm happy to kind of, I'd like to encourage us to have conversations where we can sit back and prepare a bit more. Because I know not everybody, some people like to sit back and kind of mull a bit before they come up with a thought or a question.
Yeah, especially considering that was a very intense 90-minute.
Yeah, I'm sorry for the intensity of that. I kind of tried to squeeze too much in. I would like to ask a question though, just because in the next lecture I'd like to talk about Harmer and also Quine. In the lecture after that I'll be talking about Museu and Museu. And then the last lecture I'm going to kind of give a different and much more kind of slow account of the history from a different direction. But I had said, like, I'd try and talk about Ian Grant and Ray Brassier here, and I have said nothing about Ray Brassier. So do people have any kind of like curiosities or questions about either Brassier, Grant, and the reading I set this week? Do people want to kind of ask any questions or make any points or talk about that in any way?
Somebody else calling you right now with the question.
Yeah, nah, he can wait. You guys are important.
I would say since we're sort of on the, we can go longer, but I mean in 2 minutes we're going to reach our 2.5-hour period. So maybe we can ask the questions in the classroom and maybe focus a little bit and have you describe a little bit about the assignment structure and how you kind of want to do the blog posts.
Well, if nobody else has a point, I'd like, because there was something I wanted to say about Brassier and Grant, which I didn't really get to. What I'll do actually is I'll put up on the course website. I wrote a short dictionary article on Brassier, which is a very quick summary of his stuff in Nihil Unbound. So I'll put that up so people can read that if they're interested. But what fascinates me about the relationship between Ray's work, at least in Nihil Unbound, and Grant's work, and this they also have in common with Museu to a certain extent, is they're very much concerned with this question of kind of totality that has been implicit within the metaphysical tradition, this idea of like beings as a whole, or something even more primitive than that, coming out of this idea of physis. And what they're both interested in, and Grant gets this from Schelling, and Ray kind of thinks this through Laruelle, is the sense in which thought itself, or our thinking, and in particular the thinking we're doing and actually engaging in metaphysics, is itself contained within that whole. So to put it in Ian's Schellingian terms, if nature is kind of the unconditioned, or the unconditional, right, then our very thinking of it has to somehow be incorporated in it. If it wasn't, it wouldn't be unconditional. It wouldn't be, and that's why, you know, Schelling has this kind of conception of nature as the absolute, or the identity of subject and object, or whatever. What's interesting is that both Ray in Nihil Unbound and Ian in his kind of Schellingian nature philosophy end up through this kind of attempt to think thought as incorporated within nature as a whole, positing a certain kind of limit to thought which is constitutive of it. Something a little bit similar to the noumenal that I was talking about earlier. But interestingly enough, in both cases, it's kind of temporal, but structured differently. And I'm just going to like leave you this because I just find the symmetry fascinating. So for Ian thinks that, and I'm not sure I agree with this. He thinks that the general structure of the relationship between ground and grounded is such that the ground always exceeds what it's grounding. There's always something within, like the causes, which are responsible for the genesis of anything, that exceeds that which it generates. And he thinks that when this comes to the relationship between nature and thought about nature, it means that the thought about nature, which is generated by nature within nature, is always in a certain sense exceeded by it. So he thinks this is kind of like fundamental prius. Nature is this kind of sort of primordial past that can never be recuperated. Any kind of attempt by thought to kind of return to the origin is sort of fundamentally vitiated. And I'm not sure I entirely agree with that, but what I just find interesting is that the same thing, in a certain sense, turns up in Brassier's work in Nihil Unbound, except in Brassier, rather than being a fundamental kind of prior origin, what you get is this idea of extinction, this idea of the end of matter itself, the end of all things. And he thinks that, and again, I don't agree with him here, but I find it interesting. He thinks that everything has a relation to this extinction, and it's through this relation to being nothing as, you know, what we're left with when everything is fundamentally destroyed, when matter and space and time itself is collapsed. That enables us to think the non-correlation between thought and being. So in Ian, the non-correlation between thought and being is kind of established by some kind of original unground, and in Ray it's kind of established by some ultimate extinction. And I find that quite sort of fascinating, particularly when you consider that in Museu there is something comparable, namely hyperchaos, except hyperchaos is time itself. So it's kind of, as it were, ever present. It's not past or future, but present. So you have this kind of weird Grant, Museu, Brassier, past, present, and future, in which their different conceptions of time as it relates to physis gives them a metaphysical basis for rejecting the correlation of subject and object of thought and being. Right. I don't know if that made any sense, but I thought it would be a nice little symmetrical note to end on.
I think it made sense, yeah.
Cool. But okay, so should we wrap up then?
We should definitely talk about the way that you would like to do the blog structure, or so our the enrolled students can know, and maybe ask questions about what you're expecting before
okay. Okay, well, basically, you know, I've had a philosophy blog for years, and I found it incredibly helpful for articulating my thought and developing my thought through the attempt to articulate it. And I just think it's good to kind of try and incorporate that practice into what we're doing here. I don't want to kind of make it anything too serious, but I think if everybody who wants to, but definitely those people who are enrolled, could write a short post about something related to the topic of this week within the next week and post it up on the course page. Then everybody else can read it and respond to it and comment on it. And there's no kind of obligation to do that, but I think if we do this, what we'll end up with is some more useful conversational threads that will end up guiding our conversations through the next few sessions. We'll end up kind of triangulating and understanding what we're each talking about a bit more, and hopefully kind of the conversation will be, yeah, here we are. Will be improved by that. So feel free to post up any questions as Robin has done, and I'll try and respond to those. But if you could, I mean, I've suggested 500 words, but it doesn't have to be that much. Just pick a topic or a theme that interests you, and write something on it. And the very act of doing that, trying to walk through it, would be beneficial both for our conversations as a whole, and potentially for developing your own work and maybe an essay if you're actually enrolled and you want assessment. So
yeah, I'm just going to bring up the classroom really quick, if you don't mind, Pete, just to show people what you were talking about. If you did not access the classroom, then please get a hold of us and we can help you to get into the classroom. But this is just, it's really simple structure. You have all the readings. Pete here put all the readings here for the classes. And if we go to the stream, if you go to the bottom of the stream, you can see that we have the first week a post, somewhat of a due date around the 15th, and some topic related to this session that we just talked about. And what you to respond to that, you just go up to here, the share with your class, and then here you can just copy and paste your question. You can also do this to share material, ask other questions, and things like that. Yeah, and it has a bunch of links. You can do whatever you want. You can see Robin and Julian have already asked questions. So that's the basic classroom in which we'll run those things. The only other thing I wanted to quickly show is that here we have a landing page now for each of you. If you need help getting to this page as well, please just email us at registrar@thenewcenter.org. And here you'll have all of your access to the Google Classroom, to the Drive, to Gmail. You can access the live seminars that you're a part of. You can see that Peter's is here. You'll also be able to join the live seminar when the link is available. Other features is that you have a video archive here of any class that you audit or enroll in, or if you're a member, you get all of them to watch after they're done. They will be populated within an hour of the class. And then here we have the seminar codes at the bottom here, so to get into the Google Classroom. And that's pretty much everything, I think, on my end. So sorry about that. Thank you.
Well, I promise to try and stay within a sensible time limit next week, and to not try and do quite so much. So, and we'll have hopefully more discussion, which will, with a bit of luck, stick more to the text. So, I've really enjoyed this, and I hope you guys have too.
No, I mean, it was very good. I really appreciated it. Anybody else?
Yeah, hi, I just wanted to say thank you. It was really great. I don't know, can you guys hear me?
I can hear you fine. Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, it was very comprehensive, and I really am happy to have that background. So thank you very much. I had a lot of questions, but I was waiting for others to ask first because I'm auditing.
Well, feel free to post them on the classroom. You bet.
Thanks.
Okay. Victor and Robin, do you have anything left before we close?
Yeah, I just appreciate the vast overview. It's been a while since I have engaged some of these texts, so it's great to have it sort of all condensed in the 90 minutes that we did it. And I think as we go through the class, I would still like to try to answer this question: what is metaphysics? Because I don't think we got there yet.
Oh no, the intention wasn't to get there.
No, I know, but for my own purposes, for my own intellectual exercises, I am still sitting with that question of, well, what really is this, right?
Yeah,
And what really are we doing? So
that's precisely where you're supposed to be. Because what you see is, like, wow, there's so much been done here. There's so much stuff under this label, historical label. What the hell does it mean?
right.
But we'll get there. We'll get there.
Thank you. But thank you very much for today.
No problem.
Thank you, Peter. It was really interesting.
Great.
I'll see you next week.
See you next week.
Okay. See you all.
Okay. Catch you all, guys.
All right.